Our New Testament reading for today comes from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 25, verses 31 through 46, found on page 35 of the New Testament in your pew Bibles. Listen now for the word of God. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep at his right hand and his goats at the left. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me." Then he will say to those at his left hand, "You that are accursed, depart from me into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not give me clothing. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me." Then they also will answer, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and did not take care of you?" Then he will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me." And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. If you don't eat 5 servings of fruits and vegetables a day, you will surely get cancer. If you don't exercise for 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week, you will surely get heart disease. If you don't reply to your work emails immediately, you'll get behind and surely you will get fired. If you don't pay off your debt immediately, you'll be a financial failure. We hear many shoulds like this on a daily basis, many with dire consequences. And our passage can sound an awful lot like that. If you don't do all the sheep things, you will end up failing Christ and will be eternally punished. And someone, in fact, before this morning asked me, "Are you preaching fire and brimstone today?" So we've all probably heard this story as a rallying cry to care for the least of these. But it's the motivation behind it and these issues of judgment and salvation that make me pause just a little bit. In this story, Christ appears as a king who so easily judges, sending the sheep to one side and the goats to another. And if our final judgment comes down to that moment, well, I'd be a little afraid. Because honestly, I'm not like a sheep every single moment of every single day of my entire life. It feels a little tied up in our works, And we have this list of shoulds from this passage and rules to live up to being the sheep. But fear of judgment is not the best motivation for something. If you've ever tried to change your health habits or be more productive at work, you may have found that lasting change only comes when we are wholeheartedly connected to an outcome that inspires us. Fear of something, whether it be cancer or diabetes or financial failure or the eternal punishment in this passage, only motivates us for so long. And like those other shoulds that I mentioned earlier, caring for the least of these is a wonderful thing. So is eating your vegetables or exercising or paying off debt. But that fear can only compel us for so long. It's a fuel that burns quickly and brightly, but then dies away. There is something more than judgment in this story, though, I think. The narrative isn't introduced clearly as a parable. It doesn't have that characteristic saying, the kingdom of heaven is like. But I think it has many of the characteristics of a parable. And parables invite us into the story. And when we enter the story, I think we can wrestle with it in a different way. So for example, another parable you may have heard is the story of the prodigal son, where the wayward son leaves home and makes a mess of his life and comes back and the father forgives him. Meanwhile, the older brother is a little more hesitant. At different times in our lives, when we hear that story, we can find ourselves in different places in the story. We may feel like the wayward son who has made a mess of things, or some years later, we may feel like that older brother who's a little wary and a little hesitant and maybe a little bitter and resentful of that son who has made a mess. I've even read an invitation to contemplate what it is to be the father, to care for others and to offer that mercy and forgiveness. So that's an example of how we enter into parables. So if we take that lens and put it on this story, I think some of us may easily feel like the sheep. I care for the least of these. I bring food to church. I visit the sick. I am kind to those I meet, etc., etc. I'm doing pretty good. I'm doing what I can. On the other hand, some of us may feel like those goats. Nothing I do is enough. I am a failure. I have not cared for the least of these. I can't keep up with all the need in the world because there is so much. We can get stuck in these black or white identities because we tend to be either or thinkers. I'm either this or that, and other people are either this or that. But like the prodigal son, this parable can speak to us in different ways at different times. Our identities can change because we are not static creatures. We grow. That's why we're here. And there's even another possibility in this story that doesn't quite leap off the page for us, but we may even be the least of these in some ways. In a lab in Pennsylvania, a woman named Arupa is a researcher who studies eye cancer. She needs healthy retina specimens from the eye to do her research. But when an eyeball comes to her lab, she thinks of where it came from. Because to get a healthy eyeball specimen, it has to come from a healthy child who has died. There is no other way to get that healthy eyeball. And so when she gets this eyeball, she feels guilty. like her work depends on someone else's tragedy. She knows and believes that her research is important, but when she's faced with that reality and looking at that eyeball, she feels a little bit like a goat. For you see, things are not always so clear-cut. But there's another woman, Sarah Gray, who has begun a journey. She had a son, Thomas, who died soon after birth from a genetic anomaly. And Sarah and her husband decided that they would use his death for good and donate his organs for scientific research. He was just too small for them to be used as transplants. Sarah felt defeated and full of grief, maybe a little bit like the least of these, like she had nothing to give. But in her grief, she began to wonder what happened to Thomas, to all these parts of him. And she began calling up different medical facilities and investigating. So Sarah calls Arupa in her lab in Pennsylvania one day. And Arupa tells Sarah all about that guilt, that bad feeling she has when she gets these healthy eyeballs. But Sarah said, "Arupa, you should not feel bad about it. If you didn't use my son's retina, I would have buried it in the ground. Bad things happen to children. And so by being able to help you with your work, we added a layer to Thomas's life." And in that moment, Sarah, who we would put with the least of these, out of that leastness, out of that feeling of profound despair, and because of that, she became a sheep to Arupa and helped Arupa to see herself as a sheep. And this was all possible because of their human interaction and their relationship, because somehow in the universe they came together and could dialogue about this situation. In the light of love and honesty, our encounters with one another change us and reveal more than we can see alone. We know this: whether we are sheep or goats, we are children of God. That is our primary identity proclaimed in our baptism and that we celebrate every week. We're sinful and broken, but also redeemed by God's grace, and God meets us where we are. Our lives are a paradox of messy beauty, of sin and grace. And God is working in us, but we never see the completion of it. So we affirm that grace, and that's the grace that I want to lift up out of this passage. That the judgmental king who sends the sheep and the goats away is also the king of love, who shows up in the least of these and invites us to enter into that story. Because it's that deep grace, rather than our fear, that truly compels us and sustains our loving action in the world. And the story invites us there, because we see and hear that Jesus can show up at any time, anywhere, and perhaps in the most unexpected places. The hungry, the thirsty, the naked, the imprisoned, the sick, the old, the children, and also in that place in each of us where we are small and broken and children in need of love. The story also illuminates that we can't really know our impact because we can't see clearly. It's all a surprise because the sheep didn't know what they were doing. The goats didn't know who they were not helping, and our vision is limited. And because of that, we should enter wholeheartedly into our relationships with others, expecting to see Christ and to be faithful in our daily tasks. Some of you have heard me share about my grandmother who took me to church when I was little. She would pick up my brothers and I, and sometimes also my cousins, in her burgundy Cadillac, and would take us to Sunday school, and our parents would show up later. And in that small sanctuary at Raleigh Presbyterian Church in Tennessee, outside of Memphis, I sat in pews very similar to this one. They also had blue cushions. And my grandmother would hand us money to put in the offering plate and would give us mints to keep us occupied. She would hold the hymnal and taught me how to read it. Around Christmas time, I heard the words Gloria in excelsis Deo and thought they were singing about me, Chelsea, Gloria. And I think I could have believed that because that's how loved I was at that church, born out of her love. And my love for church and desire to serve God's people began there, though I didn't know it yet. And my grandma couldn't have known that taking us to church and enduring our fights in the car would have brought me here. But it was her love and her small acts of faithfulness that turned into something big. Like my grandma, it's often the little acts of faithfulness and compassion that can make a really big difference, both in the world and in us. I was in church one day, it might have been here, and I was talking to a saint that for today I'll call Irma. Irma lives alone but comes faithfully to church every Sunday. She told me she likes to take her time in the morning, and she often goes to her local dollar store to pick up a paper because she likes to read and know what's going on in the world and to pray for those broken things. Over time, Irma noticed that the same cashier was there every Sunday. Irma liked to chat with her and ask her how she was doing, just a little brief thing. But one Sunday, the Sunday that Irma was telling me this, the cashier wasn't there, and Irma began to worry. She asked the person who was there at the counter, "Where is she? Is she okay?" And as Irma was telling me this, her eyes filled with tears, and she said, "In this world, we are all we have. We have to take care of each other." Now, I don't know what happened to the cashier. She came back. It was just a small thing. And like I said, we don't always know the outcome. But you see, Irma understood that she, Irma, is also the least of these. That because she needs to be taken care of, she needs to take care of others. We have to take care of each other, she said. And I can tell you this, Irma saw Jesus in that woman, and as Irma was telling me this, I saw Jesus in Irma. Living with a giving heart can really be that simple and small. Irma wasn't researching cures for cancer or going on the kind of quest that Sarah Gray was. She was seeking connection around her and living out of love. That way of life doesn't just come to us, it is habitual and cultivated over time. Mother Teresa said, "Wash the plate not because it is dirty, nor because you are told to wash it, but because you love the person who will use it next." We grow through our everyday life, through washing the dishes, and for caring for children or for aging parents, when we're mowing the grass, raking leaves, or sitting in yet another meeting at work. And all those little things each and every day, it is the heart that directs our lives. And is also those moments that are the chances to grow in the love and the grace that sustains us and keeps us moving to be more like sheep. Sarah Gray went to Arupa's lab after she called her, and there she was able to see those tiny test tubes of Thomas's retina, which had been prepared for research. She looked at them, so tiny, and she realized how precious and valuable they were to the world. All those researchers that she met became to her Thomas's colleagues and co-workers, because even in death, he was contributing to the world. Before she did all that, Sarah felt like a boat on the ocean being struck by waves. She was the least of these. But as she met all the researchers, she felt powerful because she realized that her actions and decisions affect others and affect the world. She had become a sheep, empowered in a way by her grief. She didn't become a sheep intentionally or because she felt like she should, but out of that deep well of pain, she was seeking healing. She did it for Christ and for the least of these. For her dead son, first of all, for her and her husband, and ultimately for all the patients who would benefit from the research. There is this cycle that Sarah and Arupa show us, and my grandmother and Irma. And I think it's the cycle that we can see in this passage. When we are grateful, when we are filled with love, we live out of that. And when we're living that love, we are met with Jesus, somehow, in some way. We can't go out seeking it or trying to do it on purpose. We can't just say, I would like to be a sheep, please. But if we immerse ourselves in God's love, we will see Jesus. And when we see Jesus, we are filled with even more love, and so it begins again. It is out of that deep well of God's love in us, which I think fills the place in us where we are the least, because Christ works in our weakness. It is out of that love that we can serve. Grace and gratitude. Those are the key words of the Reformed tradition, and that is how we are to live. Not out of fear, but with a joyful expectancy, because God has loved us, God loves others, and when we encounter others with that love, even more love, and we get to see the joy of the kingdom that Christ has prepared for us. Amen.